Dude, it's such a good photo. It's nice.
Okay, okay. We're not, oh, the bear! We're not just going to say we're going to study ahead of time. We're going to make study guides ahead of time. Within a week before each lecture has happened. How many lectures have we had in neuro so far?
0?
Is this a fresh start?
Have we had any neuro lectures?
Have we had any lectures that are on the next exam? I can't even remember
no,
that.
because the last exam was neuro. Nope, it's new.
It's all new?
Yep.
Great. Fresh start. We're going to get at least an 82 together.
I need it.
You can only get 7 questions wrong.
I need it. I look like I have bird poop, but it's just...
You're like Rick. You're Rick.
Ew. I don't want to go up there looking like Rick.
No one can see it.
It's just green tea ice cream.
Ice cream.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I've only given you one new outline today, although they're all online already. The hard copies, I've just given you one because I'm not going to give a break in between, and I do want to get you out here at a respectable time, give you the time early to get out for the break. So we want to pick up on this next outline that I've given out that has the title, The Role of Ethics in Professional Education in Pharmacy. And I might add that ethics is important in the role, the education of all healthcare professionals. And even in the non-healthcare areas, increasingly, courses in ethics are included in business and in many other areas. You can see the quotation from Martin Luther King there. I'm sorry I spelled intelligence wrong there, but it basically says that I guess spelling is supposed to be a part of intelligence, right? It basically says that, yes, intelligence and technical skills and knowledge and all that is very important, but if you don't have character to go along with it, and character is kind of, synonymous in a way with ethics, you're not going to really be successful, and he says that that's really the goal of a true education. So, ethics instruction is required by our accreditation agency. And at the beginning, it talks about the Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education, ACPE, which accredits the school. You have to be a graduate of an accredited school in order to be able to get licensed. But it lists ethics among the many required elements of the PharmD curriculum. They state that ethics, they define it as the exploration of approaches for resolving ethical dilemmas in patient care, with an emphasis on moral responsibility and the ability to critically evaluate viable options against the needs of patients and other key stakeholders. So that's why we always talk about who are the stakeholders when we're doing the case analysis. In all healthcare activities, demonstrate knowledge and sensitivity towards the unique characteristics of each patient. So the patient is key. And also, we have to comply with all federal, state, and local laws. And I mentioned that compliance with the legal and regulatory aspects is a part of ethics, too. And it's referring to the federal, state, and local laws related to pharmacy practice. And also, it involves demonstrating caring and professional behavior in all practice activities. Demonstrate caring and professional behavior in all practice activities. So that's ACPE's take on the inclusion of ethics in the curriculum. So some examples of performance competencies in the study of ethics. We're supposed to be able to demonstrate caring, ethical, and professional behavior when interacting with patients, certainly, but also professional colleagues, and also caregivers. So we're supposed to demonstrate this professional and ethical behavior when dealing with patients, with professional colleagues, and I think the cases here today demonstrates the idea of interacting with professional colleagues, especially other pharmacists, and where sometimes that's not followed, and caregivers. Then another competency would be demonstrating sensitivity and responsiveness to all aspects of diversity. And we went through all the aspects of diversity before, so I'm not going to repeat them all. We're familiar pretty much what those protected categories are. I think the one I forgot to mention when we went through that list of all the categories for which we don't discriminate in any way, I think another one that I forgot to mention was marital status. You don't discriminate based on somebody's single or somebody's married. In fact, when you're interviewing, that's not, they're not allowed to ask you any questions related to are you married or are you single. And that also includes issues like same-sex marriage. When you're dealing with a patient, that's not a relevant part of our consideration. Also demonstrating competency in terms of practicing ethically, including confidentiality. In all issues, of course, confidentiality is key, and that includes the observance of the HIPAA as well as the high-tech regulations that relate basically to protecting the privacy of the patient-specific information. And another competency would be the appropriate response to medication errors. And we have various case studies in which a medication error occurs and how you deal with it. So all of those are some of the competencies. Ethical dilemmas, also called moral dilemma, is defined as a situation where there are two equally justifiable clinical choices, two equally justifiable clinical choices, or we could say, as it goes on to explain, their courses of action. And we used the term before, in the first class, I think, the term clinical equipoise. And that term clinical equipoise refers to when a physician or a pharmacist or whoever is talking about what is the best treatment for the patient, where we're thinking about treatment, and specifically drug treatments. And there's two options that sort of look like you could use either one. And so you have to discuss, which one would really be the preferable one and all the reasons for that. So equally justifiable courses of action, and the individual is uncertain about which one to pursue or to choose among available options. So among available options, and that gets to this point of clinical equipoise that we mentioned. So ACPE, the accrediting agency, indicates that the study of ethics in pharmacy curriculum should enable the graduate to display the following attributes. And there's 8 attributes here. And we want to mention these 8 attributes because I think these 8 attributes really contribute to career success. I think if we're observing all 8 of these attributes, it's going to pretty much guarantee career success. So number 1 says respect for patients, healthcare colleagues, and that would include other pharmacists, patients, healthcare colleagues, and employers. And I think there's a tendency, some people more than others, to sort of view the employer as the big bad enemy. And that's a mistake to do that, because that'll get you into trouble. It won't be helpful in advancing your career. That doesn't mean you have to agree with everything that the employer does or wants to do, and you can't, respectfully express your opinion to the contrary sometimes. But you don't want to view them, you want to view them really as a partner, not as an enemy. 2, honesty or veracity, as we've called it, obviously. 3, an appropriate work ethic. That doesn't mean that you're going to work, 7 days a week and 365 days a year, but having an appropriate work ethic. 4, personal responsibility and accountability. 5, professional dress, which is important. It's not rigorously defined that with a tie or without a tie or whatever the requirements might be, but professional dress is something that's important to consider. 6, respect for patient confidentiality and privacy. That's obviously essential. 7, honoring promises and keeping commitments. That's the ethical principle, as you see there, of trustworthiness. Keeping and honoring promises. It also goes by the ethical term fidelity or trustworthiness, and obviously punctuality. So as I said, those 8 attributes I think that ACPE encourages, I think really can be the hallmark of a successful career. Now, in terms of the teaching of ethics, way back, the Greek philosopher, when this whole study of ethics was invented, when they invented what we call the humanities, and ethics is disciplinary-wise, ethics is part of the subject called humanities. I'm sorry, called philosophy, which is the central part of what we call humanities. And he asked, can ethics be taught? And some people would question whether it can be taught. Skeptics, for example, say that professional ethics is caught, not taught. In other words, you don't learn to be ethical by listening to a classroom lecture. But on the other hand, ethics classes, as has been added to the curriculum in virtually all the various schools, even beyond the health professions, ethics classes and case studies, particularly in ethics classes, can sensitize most, not all, but most students. It will sensitize most students to the importance of being ethical. Most students will be sensitized by studying case studies and lectures and so forth in that area. And it will encourage most people to move toward being ethical practitioners or ethical business managers or ethical managers of any sort or leaders. It can be taught, really, like any subject, like any academic subject can be taught. It can be taught, as I said, as part of the academic discipline of philosophy. But of course, some people are refractory. As we went through those lists of some people are going to be unethical if they don't subscribe to any of those things that tend to make people ethical, whether it's fear of getting caught or religious convictions or whatever the reason might be, or a combination of them. But some people are totally refractory to that and persist in being unethical. And we have case studies, of course, that illustrate that. And if they're beyond rehabilitation, or there's really, in the end, there's not much you can do about that. And we see, graduates of any school, it can be any school of pharmacy, where there's some graduates who get into serious ethical trouble. And it's thought those who are do ethical theory, or theorists of ethics, claim that there are some people who become, in fact, most people become hardwired, actually, during adolescence, probably, in terms of whether they're going to be ethical or unethical or even criminal. And so, for people who are hardwired to be refractory to any attempt to sensitize them with regard to ethics, I guess in a way there's not much you can do about that. So, in response to the ethics, to the skeptics, it says here, the education and sensitization of future health professionals is part of the process of formation that occurs over a period of time. And the accreditation agency is concerned that all the schools do this kind of thing. It is part of what they call professionalization, part of what they call professionalization. You guys are, well into the stage of having been professionalized and ready to go out into your rotations. And it involves the acquiring of habits learned from a variety of mentors, teachers, preceptors, employers, even fellow students in multiple settings, including classrooms, labs, practice sites, social events, and so forth. In that case, ethical behavior can be acquired as part of this formation process of professionalization. Ethical questions arise constantly. You'll see that constantly they arise in the practice of the health professions, and you will recognize them only if you have been sensitized to them. You should be looking for them during your advanced practice rotation. You should be looking for examples of that. You've probably seen some examples of that in your introductory rotations. Of course, even well-intentioned professionals will make an occasional ethical mistake. But based on their ethical sensitivity, they will learn from the mistake and not repeat it. So that's the difference. We're all going to probably make ethical mistakes along the way, but the difference between the persons who are ethical and who isn't is that you're going to learn from those and not repeat them over and over again. So is ethics new in healthcare instruction? Well, certainly not. The original code of healthcare ethics was the Hippocratic Oath, and you can see when that was written, so obviously that's not new. And what is meant by the term empirical ethics? Well, this is just the practical application of ethics, the practical application of ethics, so we don't teach ethics in this series of lectures from the point of view of the theories, although we will mention some of the theories of ethics, but only in terms of how they're applied to resolving practical problems. If you wanted to get a whole, theoretical treatment of ethics, you got to take a course in philosophy. So the linkage between ethics and law. When President Obama, before he was a president, he was a senator from Illinois, and he was a lawyer. He was actually a law professor as well. And he made this statement in 2006, which really signifies how important ethics is related to law, why ethics, for example, in most schools of pharmacy is included as part of the law course. And here, he uses the word morality. We could substitute ethics for that word morality. So he says, to say that men and women should not inject their personal morality or ethics into public policy debates is a practical absurdity. Our law is by definition a codification of morality, much of it grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So basically what that says is that laws are based on ethical principles, and if they're not, then they're bad laws, and people fight to get rid of them. So obviously when slavery was legal, that's not an ethical thing, and that's why the Civil War was fought. But basically laws are come out of ethics, and of course then regulations come out of laws. So on the second page, it points out a statement that sort of signals a clever distinction between laws and ethics. And it says, the differences between ethics and law. Law tells us what we have the right to do. But ethics tells us what is the right thing to do, what is the right thing to do. So that sort of indicates the difference. So the difference then is that laws and regulations, which come out of laws, they mandate in a sense ethical behavior. They mandate ethical behavior and ethical actions by imposing specific penalties. There are very specific penalties like fines, possibly imprisonment, certainly things like loss or suspension of license. Those are the punishments in a way for not observing laws and regulations. But unethical acts, in other words, failure to observe ethics and unethical acts, they produce less specific penalties. They're not specific penalties. You don't have a specific fine for being unethical unless it's part of a law. But actually, the penalties imposed by being unethical, although they're delayed, they probably have a longer lasting effect on your reputation, certainly on your reputation, which is, once that's lost, it really is going to hurt you terribly. Practical value of an ethical focus in the legal practice of pharmacy is that it reduces the probability that you will inadvertently break laws. It reduces the probability that you will inadvertently break laws if you're really always trying to act using ethical principles. Now, you have to be careful there, but for example, when you took the exam last Monday, I'm sure you got the idea that I guess that was based on state laws mostly, if I'm not mistaken. You get the idea that there's a ton of detailed regulations. And in all honesty, it's hard for anybody to always know every one of those details and keep them all in your head. If you're practicing and they're related to your practice, it becomes sort of automatic. But if you are trying to act from the base of ethical principles, it doesn't guarantee that you won't break some of those regulations, but it increases the probability that you won't. But the caution is stated in the next statement there. It says, a claim of acting in good faith. So in other words, if you break a law or regulation, you can say, well, I was really acting in good faith. I thought I was doing the right thing for the patient. I thought, in a sense, I was being ethical. But acting in good faith in a law case may carry some weight, but it is by no means a foolproof defense of a law that has been violated. So despite the value of showing that you have acted ethically, you still need to be attentive to the details of the law, because as that saying goes in law, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Well-known statement, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Managed care, which you've talked about a lot, I'm sure, in your various courses, managed care is a challenge to the ethical practice of pharmacy and other health professions as well. Primarily because the major thrust of managed care is, or at least it appears to be, cost containment. We all know that. And so we can see some of the changes, dramatic changes that are occurring, that are going to affect all of us, certainly you guys, a lot. CVS, which previously linked up and bought Caremark, a PBM, now is arranging to buy a major comprehensive insurance company, Aetna. And you know, assuming that that's going to be approved by the government, that will occur. And the guess is that it will be approved because it's an example of a vertical type of merger rather than horizontal. And similarly, Cigna is going to, another major comprehensive healthcare provider, is going to purchase or take over Express Scripts, another large, a large PBM similar to Caremark. So you see how the scene is changing. Another very large comprehensive health insurance provider in the United States is United Healthcare. And they already have acquired a PBM called Optum Rx. They own Optum Rx. So it shows the consolidation of healthcare. And these are all part of managed care, these companies, these agencies, as we know. And these mergers, which create these huge corporations, have very high-paid CEOs, as well as stockholders and all that. So obviously, the pressure for making a profit and for acting as big business corporations and so forth is going to be there. So the pressures to be profitable, the pressures to reduce costs and all that are going to be there. And sometimes they're at odds with what you want to do in the best interest or the beneficence, we would say, of the patient. Some desired outcomes from construction and professional ethics, and let's list the ones that are listed here on this page. We have 3 of them at least. The first one says, the ability to recognize those situations that arise in pharmacy practice that benefit from the application of EDM, ethical decision making, and we'll talk about the steps involved in ethical decision making shortly. So these situations, as I said, arise frequently. These are not rare occurrences, but they arise particularly in practice. They arise frequently, and even in work like working in the industry, they arise there too, but probably not quite as frequently. Number 2, the ability to comfortably and authoritatively, meaning convincingly, discuss ethical issues that arise in pharmacy with colleagues and with patients. So this ability, if you have this ability to do this, to talk authoritatively and comfortably and communicate effectively on ethical issues, this is going to enhance your reputation with employers as well as with colleagues and also with patients. So it's a good skill to have. And if your recommendations and your decisions are reasonable, if they're reasonable, and if they're practical, that has to always be a part of it, they're practical as well, and you effectively communicate them, it will really be a big asset to you in your careers. The multiple stakeholders are listed there. We've illustrated these stakeholders in our cases already, and we'll continue to do that. But it's essential as part of that EDM, ethical decision making. It's important to always keep in your mind who are the stakeholders. And they're listed here unranked except for the patient. The patient in healthcare ethics is always the #1 stakeholder that you have to worry about. Because a lot of times the decisions you make are going to really advantage or disadvantage one stakeholder over another. So you have to sometimes make decisions of, which one am I going to advantage the most or disadvantage the least. And the patient always has to be the first concern. But as you can see in this list, it's not the only concern. But the others, the prescriber, the other healthcare colleagues, your employer, who, as I said, should not be viewed as the enemy, the public health or the global welfare of the healthcare system, your profession, its reputation and its relevance, as well as yourself and your family also, not just yourself, your family or your dependents. They are stakeholders as well, but sometimes we forget to list. Harmonizing pharmacists' values with societal expectations. Well, we know, you guys know certainly, that PharmDs are qualified for much more than straight dispensing activities. PharmDs are qualified for a number of direct patient care services and for optimization of therapeutic outcomes with pharmacotherapy in particular. But getting societal recognition for this and acceptance is sometimes an uphill battle. And by societal recognition and acceptance, I'm not just talking about patients in general, because I think patients in general are ready to accept our role in that regard. And I think the success of the immunization programs in community pharmacy documents that fact, illustrates that fact, that patients are ready. But trying to get the insurers, where they're so concerned about saving money, trying to get the insurers, as well as other health professionals with whom often we're in competition, particularly physician assistants, nurse practitioners, getting them to accept that is a challenge and takes a while. To get us, for example, reimbursement for medication therapy management, and to make it clear that we're the best qualified to do that kind of thing. And that's the reason, of course, the associations are struggling to get recognition legally for provider status. The third desired outcome here mentions the ability to apply your critical thinking skills. That's one of the main things you're supposed to get out of a college education. That as well as communication skills. If you come out of it, whatever you're majoring in, if you come out of it without any critical thinking skills or communication skills, you haven't succeeded in college at all. But anyway, applying, in this case, your critical thinking skills to this EDM process are important. And here's a four-step method. More elaborate models exist, but this four-step method is one way to express how you stepwise make ethical decisions or do ethical decision making. Now it says here it becomes automatic and instinctive with experience. So you're probably not going to say, okay, step one, step two. It's just sort of automatically you incorporate these ideas. But these are the ideas you incorporate in making ethical decisions, particularly when you're dealing with an ethical dilemma. And you should think of these approaches too when you're analyzing cases. So certainly number one is to identify the issues. And that means you have to make a concise statement of what the problem is. You have to say, this is what the ethical problem is here. A concise statement of that. Identifying the issues, in other words. That would include figuring out who are the involved stakeholders, and maybe prioritizing the stakeholders, because as I said, a lot of times one stakeholder is sort of at odds with the other one in your decision. For example, if the patient as well as the insurance companies are stakeholders, how do you prioritize that in a way that's practical? The next step would be to select the appropriate ethical principles, also called values or virtues, on which to base your analysis of the ethical problem. And so, again, to mention these ethical principles, which we keep obviously mentioning over and over and highlighting sometimes, beneficence and non-maleficence, they go together. You can't really separate those two. Doing the best for the patient, doing good for the patient, and not doing harm. And so they're kind of in balance with one another. You have to balance them because, for example, if your whole total emphasis is on not doing harm, you could say, well, we're never going to give vaccines because there's always a chance that there'll be an adverse effect. Or we're going to not give drugs because of the adverse effects. But then the harm from not giving it would hurt the patient more, so what is in the benefit? So those two things go together. Other principles that are very clear are confidentiality, autonomy of various stakeholders, the patient, the prescriber, the pharmacist, autonomy. Veracity, that is a clear one we said as well. One that we'll talk a little bit more about is empathy. And then we also mentioned last time distributive justice. So they're not the only ethical values, but they're perhaps the principal ones. And you have to, in this process of ethical decision making, you have to determine which ones apply. One or more of them applies in the case you're dealing with. Then you arrive at a decision, and you should only arrive at a decision after, in your mind at least, you've considered alternative solutions. Are there more than one solution to the problem? Or are there more than one way in which we could handle this problem? And then you figure out which is the best way. You select the decision. And then finally, after you've made that decision based on how it's going to affect the various stakeholders, you have to be able to defend and justify your position, especially upon challenge. And you should assume that your decision will be challenged, especially if there's any kind of controversy associated with it. Somebody's going to challenge it. So you have to be able to defend it logically and convincingly and eloquently. Some of you have very eloquent communication skills. And if you, when you make your decision, you have to be sure it's within the law. So is it within the law or the regulations? And also, is it as fair as possible to all the stakeholders? Now, as I said, you're not going to be able to treat all of the stakeholders exactly equally, but you try to be as fair as possible to all of the stakeholders in the solution you come up with. So on the third page of this outline, it talks about fundamental and evolving ethical values influencing pharmacist behavior in professional practice situations. And the word evolving here signifies that this goes beyond the very traditional values of beneficence and non-maleficence and confidentiality and things like that that are fairly standard. You know, they were clearly, most of them expressed in the Oath of Hippocrates. But it brings in some more modern, newer points of emphasis in ethics as you know, we evolve our practice over the centuries. So some basic and foundational ethical values applicable to all healthcare professionals. Compassion. Now, what is compassion? Compassion is the awareness and concern for the feelings of others. Awareness and concern for the feelings of others. It's the opposite of being insensitive. It's the opposite of somebody who's characterized as insensitive. That's what compassion is. Sympathy goes beyond compassion. It's related to compassion. But it goes beyond compassion because sympathy involves experiencing feelings of regret at the pain, misfortune, and diseases of others, particularly patients. And patients can sense if you're sincere in that regard. So it goes beyond just compassion, but it shows that you really are hurting for their problem. They can't pay for their medication, or they've been diagnosed with a life-threatening disease or whatever it might be. Then empathy. Empathy goes beyond sympathy. I like to illustrate what empathy means with a little story that happened to me. During the years I was serving as dean, I would frequently, and I would assume the current dean gets these calls all the time, particularly when it was really even harder than it is now to get into this school. You would get calls from parents of a kid who had applied here and wasn't getting accepted into the School of Pharmacy. And they'd really, badger you about how great their kid is and this and that. And you'd have to explain that, you don't control all the issues of admission, that they do look at SAT scores and grades in your high school courses and so forth. And at any rate, it was always a difficult conversation, and no matter what, unless you could say, I'm going to admit the person, the parent or whoever was talking to you wasn't happy. A lot of times it would be an alumnus. But one year, my daughter applied to get into Rutgers. Not the pharmacy school, it was just Rutgers. And she wasn't admitted. She ended up going to Montclair. She did 2 or 3 years there, and she did eventually transfer to Rutgers, it turns out, and got her degree from what was then called Douglas College. But at any rate, that year, when people called and gave me their whole story about their son or daughter who couldn't get in, I would listen patiently, but then I would say, I know exactly how you feel. Because, and then I would tell them the story about my daughter who applied and couldn't get in, and I couldn't get her in. And it's sort of There wasn't much they could say after that. So that's empathy. Because it goes beyond sympathy. It goes beyond sympathy. In other words, it indicates that you actually feel the way they feel, that you can identify, for whatever reason, with the way that person feels. So if the person, for example, doesn't have money to pay for their prescription, or their insurance won't cover it or whatever, if you can honestly say, you know, there was a time when I didn't have money to pay for my prescription, you know, that shows that you, in a sense, have walked, you know, in their shoes. Or you know, if somebody tells you, you know, they've just been diagnosed with cancer or something, and you can honestly say, well, you know, I can feel a little bit how you feel because my mother had cancer, breast cancer, or whatever, or died from it, and so forth. So you get the idea of empathy. Respect for the dignity of others means not putting others down. It avoids embarrassing or belittling any stakeholder. So even if you have to disagree with somebody, you don't try to belittle them. Allowing others to maintain their dignity. It's always a good idea to do that. Not letting patients wait, for example, at the pharmacy counter for very extended periods without any recognition, or without even making eye contact. Now, some of us are better at that than others, because some of us are more sensitive than others. But if you know there are people waiting there and the counter is backed up and you know, and you're busy filling prescriptions or whatever, at least acknowledge, you know, that I'm sorry about the wait, we'll get to you as soon as we can. A word like that can, you know, make people feel less angry because they're waiting, or at least make eye contact with them or something like that. That's the idea of respect. Respect also, I think we mentioned this before, can be demonstrated by, as much as you can, addressing people by their name. Now, you can't always do that. I wish I could address everybody in this whole class by their name. It's, you know, some are better at that than others too, but as much as you can do that, it's really a sign of respect. And veracity, which is an ethical mandate, the moral principle, this is the moral principle that obliges one to tell the truth and not lie or deceive others. Philosophical ethics has generally treated veracity as an obligation flowing from more fundamental theoretical principles such as utility. Here, this is getting into some ethical theory beyond what we need to worry about. But utility, duty, respect for persons, or some combinations of beneficence, fidelity, which I said means trustworthiness, fidelity or trustworthiness, and autonomy. The virtues of candor and truthfulness are among the most widely praised character traits, of healthcare professionals in contemporary bioethics. Veracity and truthfulness derive their strengths from the complex support they provide to diverse ethical values, respecting others, avoiding coercion and manipulation. You've been around long enough to be able to recognize some people who are manipulative. You know, they come on as the nicest people in the world, but they're really just trying to manipulate you onto either their point of view or get you to do what they want you to do. And that goes against ethical behavior. Supporting the value of communication, eliminating the costs, complications of deception, and maintaining trust, or fidelity would be another word for that. Another ethical principle that's become very important in recent times is justice, and we indicated in our field we would call it a lot of times distributive justice, also sometimes called procedural justice. And distributive justice means treating patients equally, as much as possible. Not all of us are equal, but equally where possible, with fairness in the distribution of limited healthcare resources. And really all healthcare resources are limited, whether it's drugs, or whether it's your time, or the doctor's time, or your time, or whatever the resource is, they're always limited. It's an action-guiding moral principle that obliges us to treat those who are equal in the same manner. When individuals are unequal, the obligation to treat them in a fair manner, if not an equal manner, at least a fair manner. This means that those who have the greater need may justly receive more of a particular resource than those with lesser need. So, for example, when they're making decisions about who gets a liver transplant or a kidney transplant or whatever, they'll go on the basis of, among other things, who has the greater need and the lesser need. Realizing that resources are always limited, to meet the goal of equality of health care, society is morally obligated to provide a decent minimum of health care to all claimants. Procedural justice requires that the process for making decisions involving patients be fair and just, including decisions involving health insurance company decisions, This idea of providing a decent minimum of health care is what has led almost all of the developed countries in the world to provide some form of universal health care. And of course, the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was really a step in that direction. It's based on the idea that we do owe this decent minimum of health care, which is explained in that paragraph. So, some factors influencing or determining successive interventions by pharmacists. In other words, how our interventions improve pharmacotherapy. One is sensitivity to the needs of the patient, which is listed here. That involves things like timely services. Everybody hates to be kept waiting. Sometimes it can't be avoided, but you try to minimize that and do give timely service. Also, treating patients and other stakeholders courteously at all times. Even if you can't give everybody what they want all the time, you can at least treat them in a respectful and courteous way. And the more you can establish these effective interpersonal relationships with patients and others, the better it will work. Professional competence is essential, so it's not as if competence is not essential, it is. But this one statement that some people have sort of made in different ways is that I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. So the idea is we can be very, very competent, but if you're sort of an uncaring, insensitive person, people aren't going to react well to that no matter how competent you are. On the other hand, you can be very caring and loving and all that, but if you're totally incompetent, you're not going to do the patient any good either. So you need a balance, certainly. And then responsiveness. Responsiveness would mean responsiveness to patients' questions, for example, and to complaints. And this is difficult, probably particularly in the community pharmacy setting, because not all pharmacists have unlimited patience. And so when people ask what you might consider to be stupid questions, or when they are unreasonable and the insurance won't pay for this and they're taking it out on you and blaming you, it becomes difficult. But again, maintaining your coolness in those situations is important. Another factor determining successive interventions is understanding and adjusting to the shifts that have occurred in terms of professional values and patients' rights. And the shift is explained here is that, especially since the 1970s, patients in general want to have more autonomy in healthcare decisions relating to them. And you have to respect that autonomy and involve them in the decisions about drugs they're taking as well. So the more you can get them to think, well, this is what you should be doing, but I want you to think that this is what you should be doing, it'll work better. So that has to do with the success of your intervention. Some recent or current ethical issues affecting various segments of pharmacy, broadly defined pharmacy. It points out here, pharmacy practitioners generally and the overlay of national health care reform. Well, one of the things that the Affordable Care Act has done, and as we can see, it was twice upheld when challenged in the Supreme Court, is that it has reduced the percentage of uninsured patients. It's reduced the percentage of uninsured patients. Now we know that when we had the political campaign, I guess it was mostly the Republicans, perhaps President Trump, who said, the first thing I'm going to do if I get into office is I'm going to repeal Obamacare. Well, as you probably know, they tried to do that, but they haven't done it yet. So obviously it's not that easy to repeal. And quite likely, if repeal means getting totally rid of it, I doubt that that's going to happen. Now, that there will be aspects of it that, you know, in fact, already have been repealed. For example, they've eliminated what was called the individual mandate. Who can define what was the individual mandate that they covered? What did the individual mandate do for Obamacare? Who knows what that was? Go ahead.
That everyone would have to get insurance regardless if you were sick or not.
Yeah, everybody had to get insurance, and so when you filed your income tax return, you had to prove, you know, for example, I had to show documentation that I get my health care through, you know, through my employer. Otherwise, you'd be fined. That has been eliminated. Now, what that's going to do is that it will increase to some extent the percent of uninsured people, but it's not going to go back to what it was before Obamacare. And what it does, it kind of weakens Obamacare, because who are the people who are going to say, well, I'm not going to bother getting health care insurance? They're going to be people like you guys who are healthy and not sick and think you're going to live forever and all that. But in a way, it's those people who were, in a way, subsidizing, you know, other people who need, you know, older people, obviously, who need, or sicker people who need more health care expenditures. So it will weaken it, but it's not going to eliminate it altogether. Another thing that it's done, and as far as I know, this is not going to be repealed, is that it had the goal of eliminating that infamous donut hole. Now, you know, the donut hole was where if you subscribe to Medicare Part D, the drug part of Medicare, if you subscribe to that, after you got a certain amount of benefits for Medicare Part D for your drugs, you reached a certain point where all of a sudden, oops, you run out now. There's no more benefit. So for a period of time, up until you reach what they called a catastrophic level, you were on your own. You had to pay your own. And this created a real ethical dilemma for pharmacists, because you'd see patients who were on blood pressure medication or, you know, cholesterol or diabetes medicine or whatever, who, when they would reach that, they would stop taking their medication because it was either pay for the medication or have food. And so the pharmacist was really, you know, ethically compromised. So what do you do in a case like that? Well, the Obamacare indicated that by the year 2020, the donut hole would be eliminated to the point where you would only have to pay for 25% of the cost. So once you would reach that donut hole, you would, instead of paying the whole freight for whatever the drug was, you would just pay 25%, and the government, Part D, would pick up 75%. And I think it's already reached 40%, somewhere like 40, 50%. So it's phased it gradually, it's phased it out. And that's going to be a good thing for pharmacists. So watch that doesn't get eliminated. Also, Medicare Part D, of course, has put an emphasis on MTM, for which pharmacists can qualify to get reimbursed, although the reimbursement has not been as robust as we would like, and that's why trying to get provider status might make this easier to get the insurance companies to reimburse us. But there are pharmacists in a variety of settings who are getting reimbursed for medication therapy management. And another innovation of Obamacare was these accountable care organizations, which I'll let you read on your own, but I would just mention that in those accountable care organizations that pharmacists can participate in and get involved in, they have proven to be very helpful. So that would be a goal to try to get involved in these groups. They're sort of a kind of group practice. So on page 4, it talks about chain pharmacy moving into the healthcare business. So let's read about what that means. Emphasizing direct patient care and the value of the pharmacist's services. This trend was evident in the recent 2014 decision of CVS Caremark to change their corporate name to CVS Health. That's their corporate name now. And to phase out the sale of tobacco products in their pharmacies. As noted in the February 2014 report in the New York Times, the company's, I guess meaning CVS here, of course, the company's move was yet another sign of its metamorphosis into becoming more of a healthcare provider than a largely retail business, with its stores offering more mini clinics and health advice to aid customers visiting the pharmacies. The CEO of CVS stated, we have about 26,000 pharmacists and nurse practitioners helping patients manage chronic problems like high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and heart disease, and so forth, all of which are linked to smoking. So CVS has really made a lot of wise decisions in this regard. I must tell you that does anybody know the name of the CEO of CVS? Anybody remember the name? Some of you may work for CVS. Do you know his name?
Yeah, it's Larry Merlo.
Larry Merlo. The reason I mention it is that you guys may not believe this, but when I was very young and my hair was the color of yours, at the University of Pittsburgh, I was a very young pharmacy professor. He was a student there in one of my classes. So you see how successful he's been, and I don't attribute it to me. He's just a very smart guy who certainly makes a lot of money. But he's made some really very good decisions for that company. Actually, he's proven to have what you call vision, to make some of those right decisions. Anyway, and the fact that now they're acquiring the comprehensive healthcare company Aetna shows the continuing consolidation of the healthcare industry, and pretty much along the lines of what was described in that paragraph. So it points out here that patients need to be continuously educated as to the value of pharmacist services. And as I told you, I think the success of immunization programs proves that patients are ready to accept that. And we should be able to convince them to expect things like patient counseling, and we should be more consistent in providing it, and to use a single pharmacy as much as possible so that you have access to all their records. The DEA's intensified efforts to combat prescription drug abuse. This is trying to encourage more responsible prescribing of opioids. And many of the states, for example, have initiated limited supplies. In New Jersey, for example, I think Governor Christie enacted a 5-day supply limit when you're prescribing a new opioid, unless there's exceptional reasons, like the patient has a cancer or some chronic pain, or they're in a nursing home or whatever, would be exceptions to that. But those efforts, and there's even attempts at the federal level to limit the number that can be prescribed. Whether that'll get any movement or not, I don't know. Also, in that regard, is that all of the states now have these prescription drug monitoring programs, which you need to access to determine if the patient is doctor shopping or things like that. And encouraging things like the secure disposal of needles and syringes and so forth. The FDA is very busy reforming the rules for compounding pharmacies because of some of the tragedies that occurred with particularly the compounding pharmacies that were involved in sterile products. The FDA is enhancing their regulations in that regard. For PBMs, changes that are occurring is that the government is requiring more transparency with PBMs, particularly with regard to the rebates that they get from manufacturers and how much of that they pass on to the patient or the insurance providers. Also looking at their actions with regard to forced mail order, which compromises the autonomy of patients, and even excessive limitations on the number of pharmacies that you can go to, which would again compromise the autonomy of patients. The pharmaceutical industry, some changes that are going on there that are challenges ethically. One of the main ones I would say is the rapid rise in the cost of drugs overall. The rapid rise in the cost of drugs overall. And it's really been substantial in recent years. And it even includes unanticipated increases in the cost of generic drugs. For example, generic drugs that have been around for a long time, like albuterol and digoxin, and naloxone, and the EpiPen that you've heard about. The prices of those have gone up amazingly. So this is an issue with the pharmaceutical industry. Since 2010 up until about 2017, if you look at the inflation rate of all goods and services in the U.S., they've increased over that period of time since 2010, 8.39%. And if you look at pharmaceuticals over that same period of time, the increase has been 49.6%. So that means that the increase in the cost of pharmaceuticals has been about 6 times what the overall inflationary rate has been. So you can see that this is getting a lot of attention now. Another aspect of that are some of the new drugs, whether it's gene therapy or whatever it might be, have really, really, really high costs. I mean, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for treatments. And those are issues, too, that raise ethical questions. We don't have solutions, but certainly questions. Other issues with the pharmaceutical industry deal with the persistent shortages that are affecting a lot of places, especially hospitals, because a lot of these persistent shortages deal with parenteral products. And certain other issues with that have an ethical question with the pharmaceutical industry, perhaps a less of an immediate concern, things like the ethics of direct-to-consumer ads, the ethics of some of the tactics that have been used by companies to delay the introduction of generics onto the market. Also some of the extraordinary gifts to doctors to get them to prescribe their products, although that's diminished quite a bit because of oversight on that, both from the professional organizations as well as the government. So some unresolved issues facing the profession of pharmacy. Unfulfilled healthcare needs and pharmacist potential. We know, you guys know certainly, that based on the education that PharmDs get, that we are clearly the best qualified to manage and optimize pharmacotherapy. I think there's not much question about that we're the most qualified to optimize pharmacotherapy. But we're limited by, certainly one of the main reasons we're limited is by inadequate access to reimbursement. That's why provider status is being sought. But ultimately this is a battle with the insurance payers, the insurance providers, and with the consolidation of that industry, we'll have to see where that goes, but that's one of the limitations. Another limitation in that regard that hinders us from reaching our full potential has to do with prescribing authority. And we're making gradual progress with that, but we still have a ways to go. And another factor that tends to be a challenge in that regard is simply competition from other healthcare providers, especially physician assistants and nurse practitioners, who a lot of times think they can do just as well some of these things like, for example, medication reconciliation or MTM or whatever it is. And based on our education, we know that they can't do it as well as we should be able to do it, but they're going to be competitors nonetheless. So gradually we're making progress, but there are challenges. The impact of the pharmaceutical industry, we have to realize that sometimes people don't realize this. They think that we're one and the same with the pharmaceutical industry, but there's not always a congruence of interest. The pharmaceutical industry, for example, does not explicitly endorse the need for a specialist in medication therapy management to ensure the proper use of modern pharmaceutical products. For choosing them, and they've chosen to essentially remain silent on this issue. Another example is the lack of a congruence of interest has been the industry's lack of support for a pharmacist-only so-called third class of drugs. So pharmaceutical industry are our friends. Many of us are going to work in the pharmaceutical industry, but their interests are not exactly congruent with the profession's interests. Over the past, there have been very disparaging remarks and attitudes about pharmacists expressed by leaders of the PBMs. That's changing because of the consolidation of the industry, so that's probably not going to be a problem much longer. Some idealistic, futuristic changes needed in pharmacy. Let's see what this says. Empowering pharmacists to resist corporate and PBM policies that limit or undermine the clinical role of pharmacists. Now, let me just summarize what it says here. A few years ago, and some of you are very familiar with this story, in 2011, I guess, in 2012, the then CEO of Walgreens, a guy by the name of Jeff Wasson. He was a pharmacist, in fact. He unlike the other pharmacist, Larry Merlo, made some really, I think, bad decisions, which hurt the company in comparison with CVS. The decision he made, which appeared to be very praiseworthy at that time, was he said, we're sick and tired of these PBMs ratcheting down and down and down our reimbursement rates. So we're going to draw a line in the sand, we're going to take a stand, and we're going to not accept their contract unless they give us the reimbursement we want. Well, Express Scripts, which was the main PBM that they were working with, wouldn't go along with that. They wouldn't go along with the rates they wanted. So Walgreens said, all right, we're not going to take Express Scripts prescriptions anymore. Were any of you around at Walgreens when this was going on? Or was it too far back? Well, what happened, as soon as they stopped filling the Express Scripts prescriptions, CVS and Rite Aid and independent pharmacies and everybody else put big signs up in their windows. We accept Express Scripts insurance and so forth. So Walgreens lost a tremendous amount of business and customers who never came back, I'm sure, in many cases. And eventually they had to capitulate to Express Scripts and accept whatever deal they would make. So they lost that battle. And it shows that there are limits to what we can do and how challenging this reimbursement stuff is.
Who was in charge of Walgreens at the time?
The guy's name was Jeff Wasson. He was a pharmacist who got his pharmacy degree at Purdue University. And, you know, he was a sort of a nice, friendly Midwestern guy, but I don't think he and Larry Merlo are cut out of a different cloth, I think, you know, if you get what I mean. So that ended up being a mistake, and it shows, you know, sometimes we question why these CEOs make such high salaries. But if you have a CEO who makes decisions that, based on vision, very hard to do, that are not in the real long-term interest of the company, you know, it can cause a lot of issues. So the decisions we talked about that Merlo made about, you know, taking over a PBM, which I remember at the time Wasson said was a stupid thing to do. It turns out that it wasn't so stupid. It was probably, you know, many would judge that it's smart. We don't know for sure, but most of the analysts think it was a wise thing to do. So sometimes if the CEO really has good vision, I guess it's worth the big salaries they make. Where it says educating patients, we talked about the fact that the success of the immunization programs has proven that patients are ready to accept more involvement in direct patient care activities by pharmacists, but we need to be a little bit more consistent. For example, our providing counseling is not very consistent. There are a lot of places where it's not done at all or very well, and that confuses patients. And then another problem that pharmacy is facing is this business of increased activity, and I've talked about that enough. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me on it, but I started to work at Rutgers in 1978. I know that sounds like ancient times to you, but it really wasn't that long ago, historically. When I came here, there were 72 colleges of pharmacy in the United States. 72 colleges of pharmacy in the United States. Today, that number is 144. So it's doubled in that period of time. It's doubled. And there was no justification for that. If you look at how many medical schools increased in that period of time, it's nowhere near that doubling. Or dental schools and so on. So that this, and now that this is caused then, because of the job market not being what it used to be, it's caused a reduction in the applicant pool, and so these schools that are strictly tuition driven are scrounging. You know, they'll take anybody, as I said before, who can pass the mirror test to get into their schools, and that goes against the ethical principle expressed in the Hippocrates of being selective in who we admit into healthcare programs. So on page 5, it talks about boundaries in professional practice. And I think the first paragraph is interesting for us to think about, so I'm going to read it. It says that traditional boundaries, thought leaders within the profession have opined that the traditional roles of dispensing and drug distribution have been too limiting. Unfortunately, some of these limitations have been self-imposed over the years, especially in years prior to the clinical era, which developed in the 1970s. Since then, pharmacists have gotten a little wiser, you know, in not putting limitations on themselves and not agreeing to it. In decades prior, though, to the clinical era, the profession was too passive. This has changed in recent decades, and the profession has begun to press for more autonomy and more of a direct patient care role. The current push to obtaining provider status is an example. Increasingly limiting legal boundaries. Until 1850, there were no restrictions on what drugs U.S. pharmacists could dispense without a formal prescription. In 1850, only poisons became restricted. Gradually, most of the discretion and professional autonomy that pharmacists had to give medication to patients has been restricted, and pharmacists are now trying to reverse some of this trend by efforts to gain prescriptive authority, at least on a par with nurse practitioners and physician assistants. So, expanding boundaries, the modern view of state pharmacy practice acts. New Jersey, the Pharmacy Practice Act was completely revised in 2004. And that was the first comprehensive revision of the Pharmacy Practice Act in New Jersey in 100 years. And the reason it was updated was to recognize the quick emergence of the clinical aspect, the clinical role of pharmacists. And similar things happened in all the states. We're emphasizing what happened in New Jersey, but similar things happened in all the states. So some of the things that this revision of the Pharmacy Practice Act did are highlighted here. And I want to talk here just about collaborative medication therapy management. And want to mention the rules. And if you had this already in your law lectures, I'm just going to review it quickly, but it's important for you to know these rules, especially when you take the MPJE exam. These rules were approved in 2013, and that shows that it took 9 years to get these agreed upon, and that delay was caused, as you would guess, by the organized physicians and so forth who had a lot of questions and concerns about this. But ultimately, it was enacted, the regulations at least, to implement it. Some aspects of this that we need to be concerned about, or be aware of, I should say, not concerned about, is that it's first of all voluntary. And that means it's based on it has to be based on a written formal agreement, also called a protocol, a written formal agreement between a physician and a pharmacist. So it's not mandatory on anybody, but pharmacist and physician can get together and say, we agree to do this, and write up a protocol as to how it's going to be done. And of course, it also involves the informed consent of the patient. The informed consent of if the patient's not in agreement with it, that would be a problem. A second characteristic tells us in this regulation in New Jersey of what pharmacists can do as part of this MTM agreement, what they can do. Well, first of all, they cannot initiate a prescription drug, so they cannot initiate. They cannot do that. But they can modify. What does modify mean? Modify means changing the dose, the frequency, or the route. They can modify by changing the dose, the frequency of the route. And they can do that independently without consultation, prior consultation with a physician. Now, since this is called collaborative MTM, the physician should ultimately be informed. That's just part of good collegiality and interprofessional skill, but it's done independently. The pharmacist can also continue therapy. That means authorizing refills. The pharmacist can authorize the refills independently. And the pharmacist can also independently discontinue the medication, say no more refills. The pharmacist can independently do that. But another aspect of the regulation is that the pharmacist has to be pre-approved by the Board of Pharmacy to be able to engage in this. The pharmacist has to be pre-approved. And that pre-approval essentially means taking some CE courses. Not a huge amount, it's a minimum number of hours, but taking some CE. And this is true for other things too, like for example for immunization, you have to have some additional CE. And for those states like California and Colorado and Oregon and New Mexico and New Hampshire that have enacted pharmacist prescribing of oral contraceptives, it's the same idea of having to take some special instruction before you can do this. So this kind of special credentialing beyond just having your license is becoming more and more common. An interesting note about this additional approval by the state board to do MTM in New Jersey. A very interesting note is that if the pharmacist has completed a PGY1 residency or is board certified, pharmacist has completed a PGY1 residency or is board certified, they're automatically approved to do MTM. So you can see the increasing recognition of that. And then in this MTM business, in terms of clinical lab tests, pharmacists can independently order clinical lab tests. But as you probably learned, while they are allowed to interpret the results of the clinical diagnostic lab tests, they can only do that in collaboration with a physician. That can only, the interpretation of the lab tests that the pharmacist orders can only be done in collaboration with a physician. So since I want to be careful not to keep you guys here forever today, we sort of kept you late the last time, I am going to stop at this point. We'll pick up there on reviewing the rules regarding pharmacy technicians. Hopefully we'll review a little bit of what you learned in your law class. We'll pick up there next time, finish this, and get a new. I do just want to make one comment on something that's on the last page before we start the case. And that's on the last page, so that I don't have to mention this next time. You'll notice that it refers to a book called The Concept of the Good Pharmacist. You can see that, the title there. And it talks about what defines, you've heard that term, hey, he's a good pharmacist, she's a good pharmacist. What does that mean? Well, it says a good pharmacist helps the patient or caregiver to know how to use the medication, like how to use an inhaler or how to give a subcutaneous injection, what to avoid while taking the medication, like drug interactions or ultraviolet light or alcohol or whatever, how to monitor pharmacotherapy, how to recognize serious and common ADEs, limiting the number you tell them about, whom to call if concerns arise, and follow up as needed. The general qualities of a good pharmacist: expertise, professionalism, should say, solid work ethic, strong moral character, meaning ethics, and patient-centered. And then specific qualities of a good pharmacist is identified in the survey they did by pharmacists, by physicians, nurses, and patients. Pharmacists, physicians, nurses, and patients all rank knowledgeable as an essential quality of a good pharmacist. So knowledgeable, competence obviously ranks there high. Pharmacists and physicians both also indicated a high requirement of good communication skills. Pharmacists and physicians both talked about ethical issues like dedication, empathy, and compassion. Nurses and patients even more emphasized the ethical issues of, when they were surveyed, of what they wanted from a good pharmacist was empathy and compassion. They highlighted those ethical issues even more. So obviously ethical issues are important for pharmacists. And then they give a little survey there of how you can score yourself of whether you're a good pharmacist or not. And so you'll let you take that test on your own. And I'll just tell you that if you score 40, that's the best. So that means you're a super pharmacist if you score 40. If you score 10, not so good. And with that, Dr. Kuzma has just been so helpful with this. He's going to call up today's teams. And the first team will be doing bioethics case study number 11, which is on the purple sheet.
All right, so for case 11, we have, first up, we have Daniel Chang, Charles Dunca, Nahal, Osama Rashid, Jane Song, Jennifer Tamayo, and Chinyere Ude.
So please take your seats up here and
So
check
excited
in
to
first
go.
with,
You're the only person who's excited to go up.
Yeah.
ask somebody to read. Volunteer to read.
Oh, it's funny because it turned to her and
You
she
gonna read it?
Yeah, she passed out over
Check in with Well, I got this case study.
Can I take this? I took it. Leah, I took your water bottle. I took your water bottle. Just so I could top it up.
That's good.
I'm going to play with this now.
What?
What happened?
I'm sorry I ate your candy.
Oh, I don't care.
Bioethics, case study number 11. A P3 pharmacy student, Susie Koch, was a certified pharmacy technician in a chain community pharmacy where she had been working part-time since her P1 year in pharmacy school. Susie had strong feelings about what she considered the evils of drug abuse and addiction, and felt that in general too many opioid analgesics were prescribed and dispensed. She had discussed her concerns with the pharmacy manager on a couple of occasions, but she felt that the PIC did not really take her concerns seriously enough. On one occasion, a patient presented Susie with a hard copy prescription of a Schedule II opioid narcotic prescription with the SIG, take 1 tablet every 12 hours as needed for pain. The technician observed on the computer that the patient had prescriptions for the same medication filled previously. She told the patient that the pharmacy would not fill another prescription for this medication for the patient. The patient became upset and asked to speak to the pharmacist. The pharmacist apologized to the patient and indicated that he would fill the prescription without further delay. Susie, obviously upset, told the pharmacist that she was going to contact the district pharmacy supervisor to request a transfer to another store, and that she planned to report the pharmacist and the pharmacy manager to the state board and to the federal authorities in Washington, and asked them to investigate the pharmacy for filling too many narcotic prescriptions and contributing to the problem of prescription drug abuse.
Comment or just pass it down, whatever you want.
I think, like, telling on the pharmacist to Washington is a little overboard.
This person is going to have a hard time getting employment, I think.
Let's see. The pharmacist should have checked PMP I would have checked PMP before dispensing the prescription, since the prescription had the same exact directions as what she had before. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, also, I don't think that the pharmacist did enough to check whether the prescription was valid or not. She just kind of made a decision that it wasn't valid, and then wanted to report the pharmacist, which was a bit premature.
I agree with everything that was already said, but I feel that the pharmacist had kind of a responsibility to check and also make sure with all the prescriptions and the doctor that everything was okay.
I believe that she really shouldn't have been the one to make that decision in the first place to outright refuse the patient her medicine. She should have brought it up with the pharmacist first, and then the pharmacist, in his own judgment, should have been the one to either refuse or accept the fill. She shouldn't have gone that far.
Yeah, very good comment.
Yeah, I agree with everybody. The pharmacist should have the final say in whether or not they want to dispense a prescription.
Yeah, for me, I think as in she is very rude, first of all. She's not supposed as in talk to the patient that way, and as in it's supposed to be the pharmacist that should take care of everything and not her talking to the patient that way.
Great. You all made very excellent comments, and just a few quick summary remarks. I'm not going to repeat the good comments you already made, but certainly I would point out that the stakeholders here are the patient, the technician, obviously the technician, the pharmacist, and that, I don't know whether that pharmacist would be to the PIC or not, but I guess the PIC would be on that too, and the chain, because the chain could get sued, you know, by the patient for this, especially if there's evidence that the prescription was valid. If they really had serious concerns about it, as was clearly pointed out by you guys, that they should have been checking on the prescription drug monitoring program. And if questions would arise, you could also try to contact the physician to see what's going on here too. They didn't seem to do any of those things. And the ethical principles involved here would be autonomy, both of the patient as well as the pharmacy technician. Although the pharmacy technician, although she's accorded some autonomy, as you guys pointed out, she didn't have the right legally or ethically to make the decision without consulting with the pharmacist. Another ethical principle here would be compassion and empathy for the patient who maybe really needs these drugs, maybe really does have legitimate pain needs, the issue of beneficence, non-maleficence, of course, to the patient. So those are the issues. And as you guys said, you know, reporting this to Washington and the state board and all that on the part of the technician is really going overboard, unless what they were doing in that pharmacy was totally egregious. So showed somebody really here with a lack of judgment and common sense in the way. Very good, great job, guys. And let's go on then to case 12. Thank you very much. You made really excellent summary comments there. Number 12, who are we going to call up for number 12?
All right. So for case 12, we have David Awad, Joshua Besas, Ray Chang, Michael Chong, Fahad Khan, Manasa Xavier, and Tracy Zhang.
Tracy.
Did you get called before?
I tried to work on your voice, Tracy. Tracy,
You should read it.
Use the iPad.
That's got it.
Yeah, and then you said it in the same sentence. Those are mad. It does, dude.
All right, who wants to read? Go ahead. Case 12.
The P4 pharmacy student, Neil Desai, is on a 5-week advanced practice hospital pharmacy rotation at a 480-bed GMNS community hospital in a northern New Jersey hospital near Neil's hometown. The director of pharmacy is the preceptor of record for this rotation. The preceptor informs Neil that tomorrow she wants Neil to accompany her to the monthly P&T committee meeting. She explains to Neil that at this meeting, she must make a difficult recommendation to this committee. It concerns a kidney transplant surgeon who performs many operations at the hospital. The surgeon persists in using a very expensive brand name immunosuppressant drug, and he has resisted efforts by the pharmacy to substitute a much less expensive therapeutic alternative medication, which the literature shows is equally effective. The use of the more expensive medication by this one surgeon is adding over $2 million to the annual pharmacy budget. The pharmacist explains to Neil that she must recommend to the committee that the more expensive product be removed from the hospital formulary. She asks Neil to prepare a summary of the ethical, practical, professional, and/or legal considerations that she should include in her presentation to the P&T committee.
Pass it on and make a comment.
I think that this is a difficult decision. It's difficult because it affects the autonomy of the pharmacist who, of the surgeon who wants to prescribe this brand medication, but it also it could be affecting the charge that's going towards the patient, and it's affecting the budget that the hospital has that they could be putting towards something more beneficial.
I think that's the point of the P&T committee, to bring these concerns, because if there was no P&T committee, then doctors can use whatever medication that would ultimately increase the cost. So I think that it should be brought to the P&T committee, and then they should decide in the end what's going to happen.
I think the pharmacist is within the right to pick up the concerns, and that the surgeon's opinion shouldn't be the only one that matters.
I think the pharmacist showed veracity because this is a difficult recommendation to the committee and he wanted to put it up. I think also the surgeon was showing maleficent because it has equally effective therapeutically and just more cost.
I think the surgeon's concern is valid if they feel the drug is better for the patients. Maybe they're just not properly informed about the other drugs that are out on the market.
Yeah, I think the surgeon needs to follow the decision of the P&T committee.
So just to get some additional comment from you guys, in this pharmacy student preparing the material to give to the pharmacist, I think you would agree that the student here, as well as the pharmacist, need to really come equipped with very well-documented, peer-reviewed articles indicating that the alternative drug is equally effective. I think you'd all agree with that that would be an important part of the presentation. And that the presentation, who probably this surgeon is going to be at the meeting, has to be done with sensitivity and respect to the surgeon, But in as convincing and respectful and professional way as possible. And of course, good communication skills are going to be very important. You have to bring good documentation. You also have to be prepared well, first of all, before the pharmacist and the pharmacy, the P&T committee make the recommendation, particularly if it's going to be that the surgeon can't use the expensive one anymore, they have to be sure that they have the backing and approval of the hospital top administration. Because, for example, what if this surgeon really brings a lot of business into that hospital, and he says, if you don't let me use this medication, I'm going to bring my business elsewhere. Well, you know, that's a practical consideration. And maybe the administration isn't willing to go that route. They would say, well, you know, even though we don't like this, we're going to have to give him even though he's wrong and he won't accept the documentation and so forth, we're going to have to let him do what he wants rather than lose him and lose our transplant program in this, whatever it is, kidney or whatever he's doing here. So those are the practical considerations. I would say that the stakeholders here would be obviously the surgeon, the director of pharmacy, the student who's been asked to do this assignment, in a sense, the senior administration of the hospital, who has to decide what will we do if the surgeon says I'll bolt, you know, if you don't let me use this drug. And certainly society, in a sense, that this is going to increase overall healthcare costs, and particularly the cost of that hospital, without any real benefit if the drugs are equally equivalent, really. They would be the stakeholders, I would say, certainly the hospital. And the principles here, the principles was mentioned by our team here, autonomy. Distributive justice, I would say, would be another one. Distributive justice, trying to make products, you know, available and the cost of these products reasonable for everybody. Then, of course, beneficence and non-maleficence as usual, because you want to be sure the drugs are effective for the patient. So I would say that would pretty much summarize this case. Anybody have additional comments that come to mind here? Okay, thank you guys very, very much. So let's call up number 13, lucky number 13 case.
Okay, so for case number 13, we have Sarah Espanos, Lynn Germansky, Harris, Karishma Patel, Kimberly Wu, Angela Yao, and Jonathan Yuen.
But you're wearing blue pants. The surgeon ain't worth $2 million.
I hate new surgeons. They're always like the most spoiled and the most like, oh yeah, I'm the shit. Oh my god, look at me, I'm a surgeon. I'm so fucking smart. They're literally the worst. I've listened into a call and I was like, oh my god.
Beverly Davis is a P4 pharmacy student who is on the second day of her rotation in a successful independent community pharmacy in Frick, New Jersey. She takes a phone call from a pharmacist who identifies herself as the pharmacist at a recently opened Walmart pharmacy in the same town. The Walmart pharmacist indicates that she has been requested by a patient to refill a prescription that was originally filled at the independent pharmacy. Beverly looks up the prescription and sees that it is for atorvastatin 20 milligrams, and that there are 2 refills remaining on the prescription. You inform the pharmacist, who is the owner of the independent pharmacy, and Beverly's preceptor, that the Walmart pharmacist is asking for the prescription to be transferred to the Walmart pharmacy. The pharmacist owner tells Beverly to inform the Walmart pharmacist in no uncertain terms that we do not give out prescription information from our files to anyone, and to simply hang up on the pharmacist. Beverly is torn, but she carries out her preceptor's directive. Then she wonders about the ethical, legal, and professional implications of what has just transpired.
It's pretty, hello. I think it's pretty unprofessional on behalf of the preceptor to just hang up on the other pharmacist without even asking, without finding more information about why the prescription is being transferred.
And I think an ethical implication is that
The pharmacist isn't putting the patient first because you don't know the reason why the patient is asking for a transfer. It could be a shorter distance of walking, it could be cheaper.
Good point.
I think it's also illegal, not only unethical, not to transfer the prescription. Also, I think that the student should have followed whatever her preceptor told her, but I think there is a legal liability on the pharmacist.
I think not only does this affect the relationship between the patient and the pharmacist, but it also affects the relationship between the pharmacist, preceptor, and the student. As a preceptor, they should be a role model to the student, so indicating that sort of behavior implies that you can break these sort of rules when you're a practitioner yourself.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said, but I also feel that the student should also feel that if this wasn't the right thing to do, to talk to the preceptor about coming up with another option.
I agree pretty much with everything that was said so far. I think it was unprofessional for the pharmacist to just hang up. And yeah, I don't have that much else to say.
Okay. All right, so let's think about this and summarize a little bit. First of all, let me start off by saying what I think the ethical principles are here. So what I think the ethical principles are would be mainly autonomy. Mainly I would say it would be autonomy. And also empathy for the patient, because as one of you said, maybe the patient wants the prescription transferred to the other pharmacy because it's more convenient to them, maybe closer, whatever the reason is, the patient, they have to have some empathy for them. The stakeholders are the student, obviously the student is the stakeholder here. The pharmacist, both pharmacists, the one at Walmart as well as the one at the independent pharmacy, they're both stakeholders. And certainly the patient who's requested the transfer of the prescription. Now, while right away we can say what the owner of the independent pharmacy did is against the state board regulations, because the state board regulation says that if a patient requests a transfer, which the pharmacist on the phone is indicating is the case, it probably is the case, and if there are refills left, that you really, by regulation, need to transfer it. So here there was a violation of the state board regulations right off the bat, so that was unethical. On the other hand, you have to have a little bit of empathy for the owner of the independent pharmacy, because this owner has a business in the pharmacy, and all of a sudden big bag, that Walmart comes into town and opens up a pharmacy probably nearby where this pharmacist store is, and they're going to begin to call every 5 minutes to take a prescription away from you. So you can understand his point of view. I don't agree. I mean, it's not in agreement with the state board regulations, so we can't agree with it. But you can always empathize with his feeling about this. I think you all could. So the ethical violation here is you're violating mainly the autonomy of whom? Of the patient, right? The patient wants it transferred, so you can't counter-mandate that. So you're violating the autonomy. You're also violating the ethical idea that we're supposed to have a courteous and respectful and professional relationship with other healthcare colleagues, including pharmacists. So, the idea of just we're not going to follow the rules and we're going to hang up on you is obviously a violation of that. I think what I would think Beverly's course of action here is to simply perhaps, she's in a tough spot here. I would think that if I were her, I would tell the Walmart pharmacist that I don't have the authority of my preceptor to do this at this time, so I'm sorry that I'm just not able to give you the information at this time. And maybe you could call back and talk to somebody else or something like that. I think that's the Walmart pharmacist, if he or she gets this resistance from the owner of that pharmacy, also could figure out a way to, instead of calling the pharmacy, call the doctor and just get an authorization for a new prescription. That would be another way around this. So, difficult situation. Any other comments about this? Okay, thank you guys very much. Let's go on to case 14.
So case 14, Michael Hong, Yoon Jin Kim, Young Yu Kwan, Cheryl Matthew, John Julian Minervini, Zainabu Mohammed, and Justin Nguyen.
Did you get it? You too, Leah. How do you know?
But it's not alphabetical.
Because I went.
He was kind of going like
No, Tracy went already.
And I'm dang.
And I haven't gone yet, and I'm dead. I don't care. If I don't have to present, I'm good.
Is this a new article?
On a Friday at 9 a.m., before the start of the Memorial Day weekend, a CVS pharmacist, GL, learns that her lead pharmacy tech has called in sick, and that the CVS pharmacy district supervisor has sent a new floater pharmacy tech to substitute. The pharmacist is somewhat concerned because she knows that it's going to be an especially busy Friday. When the PT arrives, it's apparent that he is very new and not very familiar with the CVS routine. The following Tuesday morning, the daughter of a regular patient calls to say that her elderly father's Nifedipine XL tablets look different this month. When the patient's daughter brings the prescription back to the pharmacy, the pharmacist GL can see that her own initials are on the dispensing label and that the tablets inside are an antihistamine decongestant medication instead of the Nifedipine. How should the situation be handled by GL? Identify the various layers of ethical responsibility as well as the systemic reasons for this medication error. How can the likelihood of such errors be minimized by GL in the future? So I think that, especially in the situation with the new pharmacy tech, and that the pharmacists recognized that they were didn't really know what they were doing, that they should be even, or the pharmacist should be even more careful with everything that's going on. But I do think overall it's still the pharmacist's fault, so it's just a systemic issue in the first place and just being more cautious with everything.
Yeah, excellent observation, although we all can have empathy for that pharmacist.
Yeah, I think both the pharmacy technician and the pharmacist is at fault because the technician did fill the wrong medication, but ultimately it's the pharmacist's responsibility to ensure that the correct medication was filled.
I also think the pharmacist is at fault. Your lungs is at stake, so knowing that this is a new floater and she had her concerns in the beginning, she should have been extra careful.
I agree with what was said by other. I think it is pharmacist's fault, and knowing that floater came in and the floater isn't it's new environments in Florida. I think it was pharmacist's responsibility to make sure that everything was filled correct.
Yeah, as was said, the pharmacist should be even extra careful, as difficult as it would be on a busy day when you have an inexperienced technician.
I agree with what my fellow student said, in that I'd say it's primarily the pharmacist's fault. There could be systemic ways to, but obviously the pharmacist does have to report this in terms of how the situation should be handled. It's better to document than to look
To whom should the pharmacist report it?
I mean, I believe not just corporate, but at the very least document it in some sort of respect. And additionally, I think they had a little bit of leeway. Obviously with CVS, every store is going to be busy before Memorial Day, but they might have had a little bit of leeway to maybe get more tech hours, knowing that their lead tech was out.
Would you agree that the pharmacist should report it to his or her boss? I mean, whether that's the pharmacy manager, whoever the boss is, that should be, you should report it. You don't want to hide these things. So report it at least to the boss, and then maybe the boss can take it from there.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you, Judge Williams. Go ahead, pass it on. Did the mic die on you? All right, we may need a battery replacement here.
Oh, there we go. All right. So yeah, I pretty much agree with what everyone said as well.
was the pharmacist's final responsibility, since he was the final step of verification to make sure that the prescription was correct. In an if it wasn't a busy day, I would recommend the pharmacist to, I guess, teach the new technician the process of how the technology works, to ensure like accuracy checks, things like that. But since it was a very busy day, I think the pharmacist should have at least been responsible for that verification step.
Okay, I want to press you guys a little bit further here and tell me now, what should this pharmacist do with this patient or this caregiver standing there with this prescription? What would the pharmacist do at this point? What would you do? Anybody in the group up here, or in the class for that matter? I mean, what are the immediate things you would do? You have the caregiver, I think, here with the bottle. You look at the bottle and you recognize it's not the right pills, it's the wrong one. What do you say to the person? What do you do with the stuff? I mean, you know, what are the next steps here?
So the pharmacist should admit fault immediately and then replace the medication with the proper one, as well as, since it left the pharmacy, you're not allowed to put it back in stock and reuse it.
So you replace it. How would you explain or apologize to the patient? How would you be your words of apology here? Remembering that, you know, CVS is on the hook here as well, and that there could be legal repercussions. What are some other things you would do or ask the caregiver? Any ideas? Anybody? What would you ask the caregiver?
Well, you worded saying, like, I'm sorry that this happened, and then you can also ask the caregiver, did you take any of this medication?
Exactly, right, yeah. Certainly, did you take any of the medication? Did your father or whoever it is here take any of the medication? And make a note of all this stuff, okay? And then maybe assure them that even if they did, suppose the caregiver says, well, he took one of the pills. What would you say then?
You can explain what the medication is so that it's an antihistamine and decongestant, so it's probably not dangerous to him.
Probably not dangerous to him, but what if one of the, I mean, what was he using the nifedipine for?
His heart.
Yeah, so his blood pressure is not going to be controlled, so you can explain that he's missing out his medication and he should take another dose.
He's missing the medication, but also, what about the decongestant? What does that do? It raises the blood pressure. So there could be issues there. You would hope it's not. I mean, I would agree with saying this is not a very dangerous drug, but you know, there are some issues here. What should the pharmacist do with the material that was returned in addition to giving the new prescription? What would you do? Remember that term we used last time called spoliation? You don't destroy it. You don't destroy it because there could be a lawsuit. You would hope not. You would hope there's not a lawsuit. But if there is, you know, you don't want to be on the hook for having destroyed the evidence. So I think those are some of all the issues. You have to be careful how you make the apology because in New Jersey, as far as I know, there are no apology laws. Most states have apology laws which say that by making a frank and considerate and sympathetic apology, that can't be held against you in a court case. New Jersey doesn't have a law like that, so you'd have to be a little bit cautious of how you would express it. You wouldn't want to say, oh, we did a terrible thing here, you know, we probably, you know, you put your father in danger of a stroke or something. I wouldn't say those things, but you would apologize. The ethical principles here would be non-maleficence, certainly non-maleficence, potential danger to the patient. Veracity, you know, admitting that this is the wrong medication, which you probably have to do, but veracity. Empathy, certainly. Empathy would be an issue. Stakeholders, the patient, the family or caregiver, the pharmacist, the technician, whose job might now be in jeopardy, maybe if she puts in a bad report for him. And CVS, of course, CVS would also be a stakeholder here. So really a good example of a case for us, I think. And the last case is number 15. So we thank you guys very much. And whoever's going to read this case number 15, please read the introductory statement as well as the newspaper article. You can read it quickly. It won't take that much time. So the people are...
So, Jang Woo Bak, Kelsey Hutt, Jun Hee Oh, Aneri Patel, Mark Rusey, Mu Saha, and Ji Young Sun.
I don't know how that happened. Wait, how is there a copy that doesn't have it?
I have no idea.
His thing doesn't have this on here. He has the one copy that doesn't have.
Wow.
Fancy. My bad.
I guess I'm missing some things. Like that point.
Somebody volunteer in the group to start reading this. Somebody grab the mic and start reading this story. Let's go, okay? Who's going to be the reader here? Okay, Mark, want to grab it and read? Or somebody grab it and read it.
I'll read it. So please review the news report based on Associated Press news release that appeared in the April 2012 edition of the Central New Jersey Home News Tribune. Pharmacist named in the report is a graduate of Rutgers Pharmacy. Please summarize the ethical as well as legal violations implied in the report and list the multiple stakeholders.
Okay, read the article, please.
Edison Pharmacist gets 25 years. Newark, a New Jersey man has been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for distributing painkillers from Middlesex County Pharmacy. Jason Caracappa of Manalapan previously pled guilty to distributing oxycodone, a controlled substance. He will also serve 3 years supervised release. Caracappa is the last of 8 people sentenced this week for their involvement in the scheme, including pharmacist Vincent Tsai.
That's the graduate of this school.
Tsai, who also owned Lincoln Pharmacy Network in Edison, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Some of the defendants used stolen or blank prescriptions or prescriptions made out to fictitious patients to obtain the pills. The investigation was carried out by the DEA, FBI, and IRS, along with several New Jersey police departments and Essex County prosecutors and sheriff's offices.
Okay, so pass the mic around and make whatever comments you can about this in terms of either the stakeholders, the ethical principles, what you think about this situation. And so probably the fact that it proves that no matter how much ethics you try to teach, some people are going to be not resistant to that.
I think the stakeholder includes patient, pharmacist, and the society as a whole, and also the general pharmacists that they're not become not a reliable profession.
So I think the pharmacist was definitely at fault. Looks like there was a lot of stolen and blank prescriptions, so there was probably like unusual activity. So if you notice anything that was like out of character, you should be monitoring and looking at like patient profiles and seeing if these are really like true prescriptions.
I think the ethical principle involves like maleficence, and the pharmacist is like contributing to like the opioid crisis and everything that's going on right now.
So I agree that this is just like really illegal, and it's
criminal. Actually, this clearly is criminal. That's why they're ending up with these long prison sentences.
Yeah.
This isn't just dispensing the wrong medication by accident. They were in a whole scheme, you know. Here.
And it's definitely going to contribute to the opioid epidemic, and it definitely has a negative impact on how people work at pharmacies.
I basically agree with all that said. I think that showing of character has definitely been broken by not only distributing oxycodone that's not indicated for any patients, but also being involved in stealing prescription pads. So I think that's something.
I feel like the pharmacist was negligent and did not check the PMP for the patient. And I feel like the major stakeholder was the pharmacy profession.
Yeah, exactly. The pharmacy profession was hurt by this report. This was a case where this was not an error. They were out to just make a lot of money and to distribute drugs illegally. And it was pretty well known in the community that that was going on in this pharmacy or group of pharmacies for quite a while. And you can see the outcome of the serious prison sentences that were provided. I'm sure loss of license and all that occurred. Okay, thank you all very much, and we'll simply collect your purple sheets on the way out. Either Dr. Suzman or I will collect them and we'll pick up there next time. Thank you guys very much.
Can I get you my water? I feel like it's very coming on.
If anyone needs an extra copy of the blue sheets from Monday's class, if you missed that, we have a few extras.